Hey everyone, it's Blake, and today I'm going to be talking about one of the most foundational but most important skills for debate, and that is flowing, which is basically just the jargon term for how we take notes during a debate while it's happening. Um, and the format that I'm going to teach you is very much the tried and true gold standard for note taking in a debate round. This is the best way to organize the arguments as they're being made, organize your thoughts during your prep time, outline your speeches. It all kind of it all comes in one good package. So this is a really, really important skill for anybody just starting out with debate. And it's easy to start, hard to master. So let's go ahead and jump into it. So, in order to flow a round, you need at least two sheets of unlined paper. These sheets of paper are going to represent the cases, and you need two different colored pins, and these colored pins represent the sides. So, basically, think about that distinction as the sheets of paper are the actual cases themselves, the pins are the speakers. So, for LD, you have one color pin for the AF and one color pin for the neg. And regardless of whether they are talking about their own case or their opponent's case, you write everything the AF says in the AF color and everything the neg says in the neg color. And the reason it's at least two sheets of unlined paper is that as you get more into progressive debate and there's like modular neg strats and things like that, you'll wind up using multiple sheets of paper for the neg case. But when you're just starting out and doing kind of the traditional LD stuff, two sheets of paper is all you need. So the setup for what this, the way to set yourself up for success with these notes is to think about the case as being split into columns that represent the speeches. So the AF case will have 5 columns for LD because there are 5 speeches in the LD round that will involve some kind of interaction with the affirmative case. On the neg case, there's only going to be 4 columns because the AC has nothing to do with the neg case. It's just presenting the AF. So there is no need to have an AC column on the neg case paper. So, and think of these columns as color-coded, right? Anything that is said in the AC 1AR or 2AR would be written in the AF color, in this case blue. Anything said in the NC or NR is going to be written in the neg color, in this case red. And you will notice that there will be blue and red ink on both sheets of paper because in a round each speaker should talk about both cases, right? So now let's talk a little bit about the proper technique for how to flow stuff as it's being read. So like flowing a case, right? So this is the kind of formatting that I find is most useful for people starting out. So write any like header or category, so like framework, contention 1, contention 2, that kind of stuff. Write that out, underline it so that it's easy to jump to it visually when you're scanning the paper. And as your opponent is reading cards, you're going to flow the cards by summarizing the tagline and writing the author and date below. So that way you can easily refer back to the piece of evidence. So in this case, I could easily refer to this first card by saying the econ is weak now evidence, or saying the Lowry 17 evidence, and the judge immediately knows where on the flow I'm talking about. Take any other notes that you need to, like for this second card here, the Campion 21 card. I put some like bullet points underneath just to clarify the warrants of that evidence. So if the tagline doesn't summarize everything that you think is important about the card, just add the notes under the card. And then leave space between your cards because you never know how many responses. Like if you cram all your cards together and your opponent gets up and makes 4 arguments against a single card, you're going to really quickly run out of space and get kind of cramped and start bleeding into the other areas of the flow. So leave plenty of space between cards to fit rebuttal argumentations. The other important thing is that you want to keep the column narrow, because remember, you have to fit 4 or 5 columns depending on if it's the neg case or the af case flow. So keep the columns narrow. Don't write out like you would normally write. Write like a couple inches in and then go down and write under it instead of writing straight across the page. And then when responses happen, the way that you typically flow responses is you draw a line to the card that is being answered, or if it's answering the whole contention, you can draw the line to just the contention 1 label. And then you just summarize what each argument is. I think numbering arguments is really, really helpful. If your opponent is numbering arguments, then you definitely want to make sure you get them down. And if your opponent isn't numbering arguments, it still helps to be able to say, the second argument they made against the Lowry card about it being outdated, and being able to make that reference so that the judge can look at their flow, go 2 arguments down, and see which one you're talking about. Also, label arguments when possible. So if your opponent is making a non-unique, write non-unique on the paper. If your opponent is making a turn, write turn on the paper, because it's really important to remember and understand the implications of these arguments when you're refuting them. So if you just write down the analysis and you don't write down the word turn, then you might forget that that is actually offense that your opponent could potentially win the round off of, and so you undercover it. So make sure that you label the arguments with their proper title when applicable. And then include the author and date if cards are read. So if you read cards in the rebuttal, like in this case in the NC, the neg debater read a turn, the Schrader 17 evidence in response to the Campion 21 evidence. And that card you just flow as if it was in a case reading speech. And then make sure you're keeping track of the color. So one of the things that can sometimes trip people up is, as you are flowing your opponent's arguments, you're going to have arguments coming in your head that you're going to want to write down as well. Make sure you switch colors to write down your arguments that you want to make, just to keep those colors straight. And then to finish out this technique part, flowing extensions, the best thing to do is to just use arrows for your extensions. You're going to develop your own shorthand and kind of symbology to go with your flowing, and extensions as arrows is pretty much a universal one. Make sure that you are still flowing responses to individual responses. So if your opponent makes 2 arguments against your card, make sure you answer those 2 arguments and flow those 2 responses. The other cool thing about flowing is it really helps you visualize where you are extending through ink. So in this example, there's not any extending through ink because I answered, quote unquote, answered the responses to the case before I drew the arrow. But if I were to not answer and you have this wall of red text and then an arrow going through it, it's pretty clear that that probably is not going to make sense to the judge because you're just ignoring that wall of red ink. And again, you're going to want to keep track of color here because anytime you get into the rebuttals, sometimes the colors can get a bit confusing. Other stuff, just miscellaneous things like formatting advice, flow voters wherever in the speech you want to give them. So this is sometimes a little bit confusing to people because you think, voters go on my case, but the general rule of thumb for ordering your speech is that you address your own case first and then your opponent's, which means if you want to give voters at the end of the speech, you're going to give them after you address your opponent's case. So just flow them wherever your eyes will hit them at the end of your speech. So instead of flowing them where it makes sense maybe to you, like organizationally, flow it to where it makes sense for when you're reading the flow and giving your speech. If somebody makes an overview argument or groups stuff together, write it at the top of the case or part of the case that it applies to. Write important text close to verbatim. Make sure that you get terms of art and things like that from the plain text or interp for a tier theory argument, and because you want to make sure that you are understanding that argument in its entirety. And another tip that's really, really helpful is pre-flow your case before you go into a round. This will always be useful for the AF, and usually be useful for the neg. In traditional debates where you have a single neg case prepared and you know that you're going to read that every round, you can pre-flow that. But as you get more into progressive argumentation in LD, eventually you'll get to modular neg cases where you are constructing the speech, you're constructing the case before you get up and speak. So it'll vary from round to round. So in that case, it's a little bit harder to pre-flow. But the AF should always pre-flow because you should always know what the AF is going to be before you get up and start speaking. And if you're reading a traditional neg or you only have one neg case, it's a good idea to pre-flow that one too. So that's the technique stuff. So now let's break it down speech by speech using this kind of crude computer art. So the AC is just going to be reading the affirmative case. So I'm going to go to the AF case sheet. I'm going to grab the color pin that represents the affirmative speaker, and I'm going to flow, using all the proper technique that we just talked about, straight down in a column on the far left side of that AF case paper. And then the NC happens, and I'm going to start, the NC is going to start by reading their own case. So I'm going to go to the neg case paper. I'm going to grab the color pin that represents the neg, and I'm going to flow the neg case on the far left side of the neg piece of paper using all the techniques that we talked about before. And then the second part of the NC is going to be refuting the AF. So I'm going to go over to the AF sheet of paper, still with the pin that represents the neg speaker, and I'm going to flow the responses to the affirmative case, just in the column next to it. The 1AR happens, and now we're going to have some extensions of the AF case as well as responses to the arguments made in the NC. We're going to be flowing these in the color that represents the affirmative speaker. Everything said in the 1AR should be flowed in that color. And make sure that you are keeping track of what gets extended and what does not get extended. Because remember, a rule of thumb in debate is that the judge only votes on impacts that are extended through to the final speech. So if, in this example, this kind of middle area of the AF case doesn't get extended, so the AF pretty much has accepted the fact that they're not going to win off of that argument. And then on the neg sheet of paper, when the 1AR gets to the neg case, we're going to flow their responses to the neg case just next to that neg NC column in the color pin that represents the affirmative speaker. And then the NR happens, and the neg speaker is going to extend their own case and answer some of the responses to that. And then they are going to extend some of their arguments against the AF, and they're going to end their speech with voters represented by that 1, 2, 3 at the bottom of the NR column. So remember that everything that is said in the NR is going to be flowed in the color that represents the negative speaker, and then it's just going to be, you're going to write it on whichever piece of paper represents the case that the speaker is currently talking about. And then finally, the 2AR is going to be pretty similar to the 1AR. It's going to start by extending and defending the affirmative case, and then it's going to go through with its refutation of the negative case and end with voters 1, 2, 3 at the bottom of that far right column. So this is kind of the natural progression of the round, and kind of just a breakdown of what the color scheme might look like. So now let's look at some real examples. I apologize for the low quality of the pictures, but it was the best I could do. I'm not a photographer. So these are actual flows from when I debated, so these are many years old now. But you can see the organization in the colors correspond to the columns. You can clearly see an AC column, an NC column, a 1AR column, a 2N column, and a 2AR column on the AF sheet of paper, and you can clearly see an NC through 2AR column on the neg case paper. I numbered arguments in responses. I drew arrows to extend, and it's very clear I wrote very clear voters at the end of the 2AR as well. One thing that I will point out that this is not a perfect example for is you can tell that I did not pre-flow before this round because I ran out of time to write down the card names for my own contention before my opponent started answering it. So obviously that's not ideal. In a perfect example, I would have had all of the card names and stuff like that written down, but in this case, I knew my case well enough to be able to get through that round, which is just another testament to why it's so important to know your cases forward and backwards. But because this is an imperfect example, let's look at another example. So same thing here, very clear columns. The colors coordinate to the speakers. There's clearly a AC through 2AR. You can keep track of those speeches. Arrows clear through to the end of speeches in the last column. So you can see here that on the AF case, I'm extending this Mitchell solvency evidence all the way through to the end of the round. So that's probably something that I wanted the judge to vote off of. And I'm also on the neg case extending this Malik evidence that is a turn that I also probably wanted the judge to vote on because I extended it through to the last speech. So as a outsider looking back, because obviously I don't remember the details of this round, but my flow is organized in such a way that I can understand the strategy that I was going for. And if I were to have to judge this round, I could look at the flow and kind of figure out which arguments still stand for each side. And then I just have to make the decision about which of those arguments is more important under the given framework. So some final thoughts on flowing. You will develop your own shorthand over time. It is really important that you're not writing out full sentences because you'll never be able to keep up that way. Make sure that you are just summarizing keywords unless it's a really important text, and then you want to write it out as close as possible. Remember to leave space between your cards. So it's really important that you leave plenty of space so that the flow doesn't get too cramped. The only way to get better at flowing is to practice it. So I would recommend watching rounds and flowing them, whether on YouTube or in person. You will get exponentially better at flowing the more you do it. When you are competing in round, you will jump between colors quickly. That's because as your opponent is speaking, you might come up with arguments and you want to write those down for your next speech. So you're going to be jumping between colors quickly. That's totally normal. Just do your best to keep track of which colors belong to which arguments and which sheet of paper they're going on. And lastly, a good flow is an outline of each speech. So before you get up and actually give the speech, during prep time, say before the 1AR, you're writing on your flow what arguments you want to make, so then you can get up and just use your flow as a blueprint for the speech. So you can start at the top of the sheet of paper, work your way down, and then go to the next sheet of paper, start at the top, and work your way down. So a good flow is the blueprint or outline for a well-organized speech. And that organization is also lends itself to, you've probably heard, if you've ever watched a debate round, you've probably heard people say, as an off-time roadmap, I'm going to address the AF case and then the neg case, or whatever order that may be. And that's basically so everybody knows I'm going to put the AF case sheet of paper on top of the neg case sheet of paper because we're going to do the AF stuff first. So a good flow reflects well-organized speeches, and giving an off-time roadmap like that is really good practice to help everybody keep a neat flow, because the neater the judge's flow is, the better time they're going to have evaluating the round. So that's all I have for flowing. This is just an introduction. There's a lot of little tips and tricks and finer points for flowing, but this should be plenty to get you started. And again, just practice, practice, practice. If you have any questions, please let me know or leave a comment or anything like that. Otherwise, have a good rest of your day.